Welcome to the Health Edge, translating the science of self-care. I am Dr. Mark Pettis with my friend and colleague, Dr. John Bagnulo. John, good morning, my friend.
Hey, good morning, Mark. Great to see you.
To see you, as always. And we have another really fascinating topic, John, that reminds me, no matter how long you maybe have been diving deep into various subject matters, whether it's nutrition science or fitness and human performance, there are always sort of new dimensions, new facets of these fields that continue to evolve. And one of the things that's certainly not a new topic per se, but I think is gaining a lot of traction in the clinical research and very much aligned with circadian biology, is the importance of meal timing, this concept of chrononutrition, how everything in our body biologically, as we've talked about, is on a clock. And that clock is tightly and precisely synchronized with diurnal environmental conditions, sun rising, sun setting, and different frequencies of light that we know are impactful in that context. And so here we have a study that we will look at, excuse me, that is pre-publication. Every now and then we review a paper that will be published. This is very recent data that we'll look at. This was accepted for publication a few months ago, that will look at the very important correlation of meal timing. How soon we eat breakfast, how late in the day are we eating dinner, and what is that window of consumption over the course of the day look like, what we might call that eating window, and how all of those factors impact biologic aging. And while a lot of research has looked at the importance of meal timing for metabolic health, and we've talked a lot about that on the Health Edge, the outcomes that they measure here are biologic aging models, which are really very interesting and I think are very much going to continue to be part of mainstream clinical research. And so this paper looks at that, and the findings are powerful, right?
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, again, it's that alignment that with so many facets of nutrition, lifestyle that we discuss, what I find, there's a couple things I find really incredible about this. Number one, which you and I have discussed online, the fact that every cell has its own clock that's incredible on its own. But then to think about, the early human experience, right? We always hunted and looked for food first thing in the day, at first light, right? That was and is still in many areas of the world, that's still the pattern of living, of daily living. And the influences that had on our biology is still carried out today, right? And if we're not aligned with that early human experience, where we're hunting, looking for food early in the day, eating food early in the day, and then really shutting it down at the end of the day as the sun goes down, we're misaligned. And once we're misaligned, and we have a lot of food and metabolic demands coming in with the food we're eating, the cells aren't geared up for that. The cells are not compatible with whether it's handling the glycemic load later in the day, what we do with the protein we eat later in the day. It's not as efficient. I find those two things to be the most remarkable about this story, and then how that influences the biological aging that that you just mentioned. I think the biological aging, to a large extent, is how aligned we are with this, this early human experience that controls so much of our physiology. So it's incredible. A couple 100,000 years later, give or take 10 or 20,000 years, depending on what anthropologists you talk to. But here we are, roughly 200,000 to, maybe more years later, and that early human way of life is still somewhat a requisite, right, for good biological aging.
That appears pretty clear from the research indeed. And so I'm going to pull up some slides here and we'll look at this study, what it showed. We'll then do a brief detour, John, and just look at a few of the established techniques currently to measure biologic age. Because again, I think more people will be able to do this. You could take your own blood work and plug it into calculators, and many labs will probably start offering a biologic age result, excuse me, based on your blood work. And so we'll look at a few of those different models. We'll follow up with a few other recent studies that corroborate what this main study shows. And then we'll just bring it home, as always, with some practical information about how to apply this, John, not just in terms of timing of meals, but I know you'll have some thoughts to share about how you might want to comprise the macronutrients of those meals, which is not something the studies that we're looking at focused on. So we're trying to just integrate some recent themes with meal timing that I think can really give people the edge. And as we get into this stronger sun season, and I think many people are a bit more attuned, whether they're aware or not, of sun rising, sun setting, and how it impacts your experience of life and quality of life. This is a good time of year to be more mindful of all of this as you apply it, because you'll quickly realize dramatic improvements, some of which intuitively wouldn't seem to connect to how early in the day you eat breakfast or what you're eating for breakfast at that time. Things like mood and cognition and their energy, etc. So I'll pull this up. And I like this term chrononutrition, John. And again, more papers are starting to reflect this sort of newer, if you will, concept. So in addition to what we eat, right, when we eat is very important. And so we're going to be looking at this interconnection between meal timing, metabolic health, which is the driver. Really, metabolic health is either your passport to aging and premature death and diminished quality of life, or your biologic aging, and this metabolic health could be such that you're assuring yourself a longer life, an improved health span or quality of life. And really, this is the holy grail. So this is really getting to the roots of so much of what disrupts or can enhance healthy human biology. And again, you just see how so many aspects of human health, from the timing of eating during pregnancy, looking at cancer risks, certainly metabolic health, a lot of interest in autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis. And so these are concepts with wide implication for human health across the board. Anything you want to add to that, John?
No, it's like you said, this topic of chrononutrition, or the timing that metabolism is being activated and drawn on, it reaches into every area of medicine.
Absolutely. So here's the study that we are looking at here: dietary rhythms and biological aging across multiple organs. And again, this was accepted for publication just a few months ago and is waiting to be published. The group from China were the investigators here. And this is just a graphic looking at kind of a summary of the study, John. Mm-hmm. And basically, they took NHANES data. So like so many studies today, they look at a large cohort. So this is thousands of individuals in the NHANES data. These were adults. And of course, based on food frequency questionnaires, which we know do have some inherent drawbacks, but this is the methodology that's sort of the standard of care for so much of the nutritional epidemiology. They looked at the first meal time, so how soon after waking up did you consume your first meal, your breakfast? They looked at last meal time. What was the, really how soon before bedtime did you consume that last meal? And what we're seeing today, John, and I think this is part of the sort of computational capacity, the sort of revolution of big data management and analysis and AI, artificial intelligence, is when you've got a database, excuse me, as robust as NHANES, you can interpret and look at various ways to interpret the data that often reveals patterns that the average human brain will not be able to see. And so they're able to fine-tune algorithms based on these machine-based learning models that help them determine what are the best variables to predict biologic age, and they look at the correlation between chronologic age, right, your date of birth and how old are you based on that, and biologic age, which for many will correlate with chronologic age, but really the point of a lot of this research is to identify what might help people age more slowly. And so these would be individuals whose biologic age is less than their chronologic age. That would be considered a very healthy trajectory and a pretty good predictor of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular, cancer mortality, metabolic health, quality of life. Or is your biologic age older than your chronologic age? And that would suggest accelerated aging, and that would point to what are probably various metabolic health disruptors and things that one can do to change that trajectory. And then the results here, which I have a separate slide summarizing, because I realize anyone looking at this for the first time, it's a kind of a busy slide. But the bottom line is that the last mealtime earlier in the day, and these are the two parts of the graphic here, John, that this is looking at, starting at 3 p.m. up until the upper limit of 7 p.m. was the best predictor, predictor of lower biologic aging, measured both as sort of total body. They looked at total body biologic aging. And then some of these techniques, as we'll look at in a moment, allow you to measure organ-specific biologic aging. And they looked at liver, they looked at kidneys, and they looked at heart. And across the board for organ and biologic aging, the earlier dinner hour was clearly a better match, a better alignment with biologic age.
And after 9 p.m., that's when you're in the danger zone here.
That's when you're in the danger zone. And of course, a lot of people eat very late in the day and often right up until bedtime. And again, that first meal, generally within 2 hours of waking up, seemed to be the best predictor of slower biologic aging across the board as compared to having that first meal after noon. So somebody goes to bed at 1 a.m., they wake up at 9 a.m., they don't really get around to eating until afternoon. That late day first meal, that close to bedtime late day last meal are major disruptors of biologic age. And that's essentially what they were looking at here. And again, unlike we know that this sort of correlates with metabolic health, obesity, high blood sugars, prediabetes, diabetes, hypertension, high triglycerides, right?
Just weight gain in general, Mark, right? I mean, we could take this conversation, you know, outside of the biological aging topic, just for our listeners' sake, and we could say, hey, this is the number one reasons that in the past so many college students had such significant weight gain in their first semester, their first year of college, right? You know, you're out of that high school kind of way of life, that pattern where you get up early in the morning, go to school, and you eat at least something, you're active, and then you get to college. And I think a lot of people think about that freshman 15 or whatever number you want to assign to it, and they tend to think more about the what students are eating. I always ask, student athletes, I always ask them to reconsider the when they're eating. And like you're saying here, right, a lot of those first year college students, they're up much later than they would have been in high school. They're up, like you're saying, 1 or 2 a.m., not eating until noon or later. And I think that's more responsible for that weight gain and all the changes that we see in college students. So, I mean, again, I don't mean to digress here, but just for our listeners' sake, we're not just talking about biological aging, which this paper does a remarkable job of identifying and really, showing the effects. But this spills out into just really much broader effects on human health.
Definitely. And there's a robust research base when you look at night shift workers, healthcare, first responders, much higher prevalence across the board. We know of weight challenges, insulin resistance, inflammation, depression. And so I think that is a good example of where this biologic aging data, if there's any value or utility, it does seem to be a good predictor of the burden of chronic, complex health disease challenges that people confront, and very much predicts health span challenges. And as always, John, what we love about these topics is they always come out the other end with very discrete lifestyle behavioral changes that one can consider that can realign these clocks. And so this mismatch between these biologic clocks in each cell in our body, all 30 trillion cells, and the extent to which modern life confronts us with options that are no longer aligned or compatible with the memories that our bodies hold, that our cells hold, of what circadian timing should look like. And so there's so much validity, and I think the biologic age markers, as they gain traction and popularity in the research, are going to become important predictors of the future. And that can be very helpful and motivating for people who might be struggling with behavior change. So I'll bring these slides back up, John.
Yeah, and I think that, again, to just with that last slide, I think for some of us, that last meal of the day at 3:00 in the afternoon, that's tough, right? I mean, especially, I have a young family, so I'd have to pretty much, for me to have something like that would be really tough. But I don't think you have to ruin good for best. I mean, I think that's the take-home message here, because whether it's 3:00 or it's 5:00, those are, again, with a family and wanting to have that meal and thinking about the social value of it.
Exactly.
You got to weigh some of those cost benefit ratios with this. But what's really clear, and what this corroborates, is that anytime you're eating after 7:30, it's a downward spiral from there in terms of human physiology. So if you can eat at 5, great. But I think this is just further evidence that you really got to shut down the kind of the feeding window at around 7 or 7:30. Otherwise, you get into that, metabolic. It's really promoting metabolic syndrome for just about everybody.
Exactly. And it's such a great point, John. Like any clinical study, any recommendation for a lifestyle change, one has to always best adapt to their unique circumstances. And it's so funny, John. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm about to turn 70. My wife is a few years older than me. And it's easy when you're young to kind of tease older adults and how early they eat.
Yeah. And how early they shut it
Right,
down.
the old
Yeah.
blue plate
Yeah.
special.
Right.
And
Right.
excuse me, that senior discount, right, at 4 p.m.
Right.
Of course, our kids are grown, and to your point, we're up much earlier. We go to bed much earlier. So the two of us are, 5 p.m. supper time,
Yeah.
and a little bit earlier on occasion. We'll have an earlier meal, and it's been easier to adapt that to this sort of chapter in our lives than it would have been when our kids were young. But it was still within that window. Even when we had young kids, we tended to eat before 7 o'clock. And while these studies look at adults, I think it's important to consider the fact that, when kids are eating at all hours of the evening and night, it's definitely going to disrupt their sleep. They
Yeah.
probably aren't going to perform as well in school. So these are obviously relatable to anyone across the age continuum. But this is the basic conclusions that we just looked at here, John. Eating breakfast earlier in the AM after awakening was clearly associated with metabolic benefits. And there are some macronutrient considerations, though these studies, again, didn't look at that. They just looked at meal timing, not meal quality. I know you're very interested, John, in the research that would suggest that not only is an earlier breakfast important, but what we consume at that meal has huge implication for muscle protein synthesis, insulin and glucose management, satiety. Recently, we talked about thermogenesis. And so I just want to pause here for a second and have you talk a little bit about what an ideal breakfast might look like.
Yeah, no, it's definitely the greatest return on the whatever protein you eat during a day for whatever reason, whether that's for basic repair processes, an effort to gain lean body mass, or to have a better kind of like more fat burning metabolism. You're going to get the greatest response in all of those areas with a high protein, high fat breakfast. Because that thermogenesis, that heat that is produced when your body metabolizes protein, it carries over the rest of the day. It kind of raises your body's your body's thermostat, let's say, for the day. So you're going to burn a little hotter, and you're going to burn more calories. You're going to be just more metabolically active. You're going to be more insulin sensitive. You're going to get greater muscle protein synthesis, as you already said. For every gram of protein that you consume in the morning, it's much more efficiently used, right? You're going to get, an X factor of somewhere around like 0.8. So you're going to get 80% of that protein is going to help you restore, rebuild, or build muscle, as opposed to it might being under 50% when it's eaten later in the day. So you're just getting a much, much greater window of potential for favorable influence on your metabolism and your body composition with that high protein, high fat breakfast, because you're making your body prefer a fat burning metabolism the rest of the day. You're building more muscle in that early part of the day. And again, it's amazing, Mark, because I look at this on the cellular level, but I also, the ancestral component to this is just remarkable, because that's how humans ate. And that's where we got the majority of our nutrients, our energy over the course of human history. And this last few hundred years is just an aberration from that. And really, the clock that we all carried, it hasn't changed.
What does a typical breakfast look like in the Bagnolo home?
Yeah, I really try to get our kids and myself, 30 to 40 grams of protein. This morning I had 4 eggs. I poached 4 eggs. And then we do use these, they're lower carbohydrate. It's a great product. Someday we ought to do just quick reviews on different products that are out there. There's a product made with avocado oil, cassava flour, psyllium husk. I think those are the only 3 ingredients. And there's like 10 grams of carbs in one of these wraps. The name of the brand is Rise and Puff. That's the name of the brand. They're hard to get. You kind of got to get them online. But I heat up one of these wraps, and I put 4 eggs and probably 3 to 4 ounces of mozzarella cheese. I melt the cheese on the wrap, and I put the 4 poached eggs on it. And I try to get all my kids to eat that combination, as well as myself. And that gives around somewhere between 30 and 40 grams of protein, and there's only 10 grams of carbohydrates there, and it's a safe starch in the way of cassava flour. And then I'm ensured that my kids are getting those eggs, which are just so valuable for kids and their development. So that's a really common breakfast. Or I'll take full fat yogurt, and I'll take roughly a half a tub, so about 16 ounces or so, and I'll put in like 40 grams of whey protein, and it really thickens up the yogurt. You let it sit for just a couple minutes, and that fully solubilizes the whey protein, and you'll actually see it start to bubble a little bit as the bacteria in the yogurt starts to actually work on the very small amounts of lactose that's in that whey protein. And that's going to give me about 50 to 60 grams of protein. So those are 2 really common breakfasts that, I know kind of get me going in the right direction. And I feel so much better on those days. Recover better from my workouts. I'm pretty active in the late afternoons or evenings with coaching. And I know when I don't have one of those types of breakfast, Mark, that kind of give me the foundation for the day, I really feel it later in the day. And I want to eat a lot more food later in the day, which I don't want to do. But, that's the thing about this that we haven't talked about, which is most people are going to have a certain set point of calories that their body needs, or that they're going to be driven to consume, right? And so the downside to not eating until noon is a lot of people have that much, much greater cravings and that drive to eat so much more food in the evening, that if you can kind of shift everything forward and get say you can get 600 or 700 calories in the first 2 or 3 hours of light, your body's much, much more content not eating at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night. I'll come home some days where it's like, for whatever reason, crazy morning schedule, and I'll find myself in the kitchen at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, because we've just been gone all day, and you feel like you got to eat something. You're ravenous. You don't feel like you can fall asleep, and then those are the nights where, to your point, I end up eating food after dark, and I don't sleep very well. So you can really feel and experience everything we're talking about, and I'm sure most of our listeners understand this. I've got athletes that I work with that wear these sleep quality monitors, many of which you're very familiar with, right? And they say that when they eat at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, that their heart rate variability is very poor. Their sleep quality that's where they get their lowest scores. So I think there's a lot of different ways people can immediately connect with the narrative here that we're sharing, right? Which is that if you want to sleep better, you want to eat your dinner earlier. If you want to be at a better weight, if you want to build more lean body mass, you want to eat more of your protein early in the day. It's all aligned. It's all aligned. Biological aging is something that I think a lot of our listeners are concerned with. Everybody wants to age at a healthier trajectory. But if you want to sleep better, you want to have more energy, you want to be stronger, you want to have better bone density. I mean, you just pick your area, right? You just want to be the best version of yourself. Give it a try. Just fight the urge to just kind of get going into your day without eating. And I talk to people about this all the time. If you give yourself a couple weeks with a substantial high protein breakfast, you really find that you miss it when you don't have it. It becomes much easier, because a lot of people tell me, and I don't know if you've probably heard this over the years as well, people say to me, I just don't feel like eating in the morning. Well, in a way, that's kind of like, you haven't really given it enough time to sink in. It's like when people say, I don't like to exercise. I'm like, well, yeah, I can understand that. But once you start exercising, you love how it feels. It's the same thing. You got to just give yourself a chance to adapt to that first morning meal.
Such great points, John. And these are such easy things to play with and to see how one does with it.
Yeah, Mark, I like that. You always say, right, you're an N of one. Experiment with it, right?
Yes,
What's the downside?
exactly. In much the same way that eating an earlier breakfast is very important to slow biologic aging. Eating dinner, supper earlier in the day, as we've talked about, also comparable benefits with respect to the slowing of biologic age. And um, most of the findings in the study with respect to the eating window suggested, and I'll come back to the graphic of the study, uh, generally feeding durations of less than 10 hours. So let's say breakfast at 8, you'd be looking at supper up to like 6 p.m. It was that 10-hour window that best predicted slowing of biologic age for total body, heart, liver, kidney, and the inverse of that. Once that window expanded, and this was a kind of a linear relationship, particularly when that window started getting up uh, above 12 hours to 16 plus hours, so that
Yeah.
essentially a person is eating something throughout the day, except when they're actually sleeping. Dramatic uh, um, increases or acceleration of biologic aging. And so the bottom line, right, and it, like so much of the great ancient wisdom, I know my grandmother and mother, and certainly probably any mother, grandmother, um, who love their kids and grandkids of the last several hundred generations, just sort of understood that breakfast was the most important meal of the day. And I heard that every morning from my mother.
Yeah.
Heard it from my grandmother when I lived with her, and they just sort of knew. Um, and it was almost always included an eggs. It almost always included whole fat dairy. It almost always included some type of meat, and that was they just sort of understood that. And as we often talk about, John, there is this sort of curious loss of ancestral wisdom that we. Uh,
Yeah.
and so today it's like, oh, it one might not even think twice about having their first meal at noon, thinking that this is a good thing. And in years past, I was part of that club.
And Mark, I'll just say from experience that, over the years of working with clients, the most difficult weight loss clients or challenges have been those who just can't adapt to that early morning meal pattern. The folks that just find it, whether it's due to their schedule, whether it's due to their just lack of interest in food, or they don't feel like they can tolerate food early in the morning. Those are the folks that I feel have the most difficult time really changing body composition and getting the metabolism they want. And I would honestly, at this point in my career with my experiences, I would say I'd have a hard time answering the question, what's more important, what you eat or when you eat. I mean, and again, of course, I think it's really important what somebody eats. But if someone were to shut it down at 5 o'clock at night, not eat after 5 o'clock, I'd have a hard time betting that wouldn't be more favorable in the end than what it is they were eating, but they're eating it really later.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would suspect, John, the research seems very consistent. Those that struggle most with an earlier breakfast are those that have the most disrupted circadian
Yeah.
biology, and uh, in much the same way that, one of my favorite questions for people, particularly in the domain of sleep, is do you require an alarm clock to get up in the morning? And
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
somebody tells me, oh, I can't get up without an alarm clock and I have to hit it 3 or
Yeah.
4 times each
Yeah.
morning, uh, that to me is an everyday experience of life that is a huge flashing red light with respect to how disrupted your circadian biology is.
Yeah.
And on any given morning, that may just feel like a nuisance. Um, but in reality, it is a manifestation of something much deeper going on.
Yeah.
And so, to the point that you made, John, really one has to allow themselves some adaptation, because once you've hacked those deeply conserved circadian
Hmm.
biologic patterns, um, while you can totally readdress it, it can take some time. It can take
Yeah.
several weeks even, and so one has to be sort of patient when they're looking to challenge a current lifestyle pattern that may not be serving them well. And um, so those are all such good points. Let's just briefly pivot, John, as our time is a bit limited, but with just some of the current research around these biologic aging
Yeah.
clock measures. And the way that I think about this is that there are two general categories of biologic clocks. One category, which has become very popular and is the epigenetic clock. This essentially involves, usually it's a swab of the cheek, or maybe a saliva sample where they get cells from your cheek and measure the epigenetic methylation patterns, right? So we talk a lot about in DNA how you've got these genes that code for proteins, but most of DNA, in fact, has a regulatory function of those protein coding genes. And one ways in which humans and mammals um, adapt how proteins are produced through DNA translation is through methyl attachment, these methylation
Mm.
groups. And so there's a lot of data now, the last 10 years, looking at various techniques of measuring these methyl patterns. And again, through AI and very high computational capacity, they can uh, evolve and develop algorithms that allow more accurate prediction of one's aging beyond chronologic aging using these methylation patterns. So it's really a kind of a DNA test, if you will. Uh, the functional biologic aging clocks are a second category that doesn't require um, a cell sample. Most of this can be done just with blood work and commonly obtained blood work, which is why it's become such a popular tool for these clinical investigators. People in the NHANES database,
Mhm.
people in the UK Biobank database have all had basic blood work, chemistries, and CBC, a blood count of the red blood cells and white blood cells. And these methodologies leverage that commonly available blood work data, along with often blood pressure, heart rate, to give you a biologic age. And so it's a different methodology, but one that tends to be a little bit logistically easier, because one can take
Mm.
existing blood work that's already been done and then use these more refined algorithms to assess and validate biologic age. And so, one of the two most common functional tests are the KDM method, this Clamara-Duval method, which was published a few years back. And that's what the investigators of this lifestyle rhythms and biologic aging study applied. There's also the PhenoAge, which is, these are very similar. PhenoAge is also a functional test that based on blood work, can give you your biologic age. But because this blood work also looks at organ-specific function, like a creatinine for kidney function, or liver function test for liver function, these methodologies also allow you to give an organ-specific age. And I think it's fair to say that, we're still in the early iterations of this, but there have already been 3 generations of epigenetic clocks. We're in this knowledge explosion. And so these are going to continue to rapidly evolve, but they're getting more accurate. And I think they will be nice, non-invasive, inexpensive ways for people to track beyond how they feel, beyond what might be a disease measure that they're managing or treating. Give them a sense of just sort of globally, how is their biology relative to, the average population? And in my experience, it can be a powerful motivator for behavior change when you start to, at the age of 30 or 40, consider the fact that by the time you're 60, you're looking at what could be a biologic age of 80. So, we're all trying to outrun, father time or mother time. Research would suggest that healthy lifestyles, healthy mindsets, healthy, all the things that we talk about, those sort of ancestral paleo-adapted lifestyle patterns very much seem to predict longer life and better quality of life or health span. And so just categorically, these are, and then again, this KDM, this Clamara-Duval method has stacked up very well as compared with some of the first generation epigenetic clocks. I think Stephen Horvath, if I have his name right, Dr. Horvath at UCLA developed one of the first generation epigenetic clocks. That was about 10 years ago. And so these blood-based methods, blood test-based methods are generally considered today even more accurate than those earlier epigenetic clocks at predicting health outcomes, mortality, and maybe slightly better than some of the second generation epigenetic clocks. And again, these methodologies continue to evolve. The current thinking in my review of the research, John, is that epigenetic clocks seem to excel at predicting chronologic age with very high precision. So the correlation rates between a chronologic age and a biologic age for the average, the general population tend to be very precise with epigenetic clocks. But these functional tests, like the KDM method and the PhenoAge, seem to be really good at capturing sort of quality of life, health span related characteristics, are emerging as important predictors of mortality, all-cause mortality, as well as disease-specific mortality, cardiovascular, and say cancer, for example. And again, these functional methods do take into account blood pressure and blood glucose. And all things considered, they're very good methods. And this is just the PhenoAge, the second sort of functional test that I think is most popular. And
most labs now are putting some algorithm together with this, right? Function Health and all those stuff.
Exactly. So when you have blood work done at some of these more functional labs, in addition to the individual results, they'll give you your biologic age. And these are the algorithms that they are using. And again, it's blood work. The PhenoAge looks at a different sort of cadre, some of the same things, but not entirely the same, from liver and renal function, markers of inflammation, The PhenoAge looks at, and I find this really interesting, John, because these are results that come with every complete
Hmm.
blood count, CBC, but they tend to get ignored by
Yeah.
most clinicians. Usually you're looking at the white count and your hemoglobin and platelet count. Um, Over half the CBC tends to get overlooked,
Yeah.
where there's some validity to many of the measures, like uh, what percentage of your white blood count are lymphocytes, which are immune cells?
Hmm. Hmm.
What what when you look at your red blood cells, what is the size, the volume of those blood cells? People that have more uniformity,
Hmm.
homogeneity, uh, that would tend to predict slower biologic aging as opposed to a
And a
CBC.
lot of that, yeah, and a lot of that has to do with methylation, as you know, right?
Yes,
And so the nutrient density of the diet comes into play here as well. A lot of people, as you know, are somewhat deficient in those methyl donors that they need for some of these key processes. And so that's what's beautiful about some of these algorithms is it does bring in, you know, different facets, not just when you eat, but also the nutrient density of the diet.
exactly. And so again, I think these are all really good and
Yes.
continuing to improve methods for assessing biologic age. If any of our listeners are interested in that, generally you'd have to purchase a separate kit to measure your epigenetic age. Insurance is not going to cover that in the current state. As I said, many of the blood tests that you've already had could be used in the PhenoAge and the KDM methodologies. So for functional physiologic decline mortality risk, the KDM and PhenoAge, as of today, are generally considered as or more accurate
Yeah.
for cellular aging, for chronologic age estimation. The epigenetic clocks are generally more accurate, and so people people can think about considering this as part of their uh, database, their portfolio of self-care and biomarkers and measures, and this can be obviously very useful. I think these tests are most useful for trending, John.
Yeah.
Trending to get those patterns, those trajectories, but also trending to demonstrate just how powerful lifestyle can be in slowing one's biologic aging, which is what we all aspire to do. And this is just another study that I think you had shared with me, John, and a study from Spain. Again, looking at timing of meals, not focusing on biologic aging per se, but more on obesity and metabolic risk. And again, not surprisingly, I'll just jump to this graphic, which summarizes. This was looked at individuals over 20 weeks, over about 5-6 months, and looked at the correlation, of course, between those that ate early, the later eaters, both late breakfast, late dinner, early breakfast, early dinner, and looking at body weight in kilograms over time. And you get, again, pretty early on, you can be,
Yeah.
a month, you start to see a separation where the late eaters just aren't, they start to plateau, right? You can only go so far. And I'm
Hmm.
sure you, John, and the countless number of people you've consulted with will frequently come to you because they've had an initial result for whatever it was that they were doing, but they hit the wall, they hit the plateau, and need help looking at how they can move beyond that. While you see not only uh, a significant separation with the early eaters, but it's a trend that seems to continue. There's this sort of this linear dose effect, which I find important. And just another graphic again, how sort of moving away from calories in, calories out, right? Meal timing. These studies aren't really looking at the meal quality, they're not even looking at the number of calories you're consuming. They're just looking at the timing of the meal. And so again, early breakfast, and here on this graphic, they're looking at the midpoint of total caloric consumption for the day. And so these are people who've hit their midpoint generally by midday and have completed their caloric consumption minimum a few hours before bedtime, as opposed to individuals getting up late, eating late, first meal, last meal, how their midpoint of caloric intake for the day is very late in the day, late afternoon. They're just at their midpoint. And so you see that skewing on the diurnal rhythm toward much later in the day. And this DLMO is when dim light melatonin starts to turn on. People think melatonin starts when we fall asleep or at the time that we're falling asleep. Our bodies start producing melatonin as the sun is low in the sky. So metabolically, biologically, the nighttime cycle, at least as measured by the emergence of dim light melatonin, is a few hours before bedtime. And so that may be one reason why one sees disruption eating too close to bedtime, is that that melatonin signaling is very disrupted if you don't allow those few hours. And again, the phenotype is a very different phenotype. Same person, a very different trajectory of health. And I'll pause there and let you comment, John, and then we can end with a kind of a summary slide, putting this all together.
Yeah, I mean, again, we touched a little bit about first year college students. I had a physician that I knew from Japan. This is quite some years ago. That said, hey, in Japan, when world champion sumo wrestlers are training, they're not allowed to eat until something like, after afternoon. It was like whether it was 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And, they can eat all the food, that they want, all the bowls of white rice and everything. But if that food is eaten, early in the day, they tend not to gain the type of weight that they need to be a, champion sumo wrestler. And that always, I always thought that was astounding. Obviously, there's no double-blinded placebo study here that I'm referring to with this. It was just something that is anecdotal that I've heard now. I've also read it somewhere. I can't remember where, but so you have all these different examples, right? That I think these studies now are illustrating. And the point that I like that you just made about that one, Mark, which is that dim light melatonin secretion that starts, let's just say around 5 o'clock or so. You start compounding these things, right? So, largely we're talking about time restricted eating here and trying to shift that around so your window's earlier in the day. But I think for our listeners' sake, I'm sure that they can connect the dots now. And you start thinking about the exposure to blue and white light late in the day, right? All the fluorescent lights that a lot of people are under, after 7 or 8 o'clock at night. They're eating at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. It's a wonder that anybody sleeps that has that pattern. And now you start thinking about all the efforts to really help people with better. There's all these different attempts, sleep studies, but I mean, some of this stuff is somewhat blocking and tackling, right?
Blocking and tackling, such great points, John. And as we reflect on other aspects of lifestyle that influence circadian biology, you see how quickly this compounding takes effect. With we know that eating a late day meal under blue light gives you a different glucose and insulin excursion. You'll have higher sugar. Same meal consumed at 9 p.m. will give you a much higher insulin glucose response than eating that meal at, say, 5 p.m. In much the same way that we know people who harbor maybe more fear in that fight-flight mode, for whatever reason. I mean, there are so many reasons
Mm.
to provoke fear, from, just hearing the news on any given day, to worrying about the bills, worrying about one's health, maybe being a caregiver for a loved one. Um, how that, those high cortisol, high adrenaline states, which are best experienced earlier in the day, not 24/7, further add another layer of complete disruption of circadian biology. And so it it we sound like broken records, but the modern environment is so heavily stacked against us that if we're not mindful of how we are, behaving, and what our lifestyle choices are, that default mode, that architecture of modern life will assume itself, and you have now handed over your
Yeah.
biologic legacy to a set of conditions that, for most, even if you get away with it at a certain age, it will catch up with you, because disrupted biology won't go away unless you do something to make it go away. And so you just see, how does anyone sleep at night? And John, a lot of people don't.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Majority,
Yeah.
uh, how does anyone go without gaining weight? Well, almost everyone is overweight now.
Yeah.
We've looked at metabolic health. So how does anyone get through life without disruptions to their metabolic health? We know from the NHANES data that over 90% of Americans would not meet criteria for normal metabolic health. So the phenotype, the epidemiology, is 100% consistent with all of these underlying mechanisms, much of which can be traced to gene environment mismatch. This paleo approach that we like to sort of embrace, and it's the elephant in the room. At the same time that all of this is happening, there's a tendency to say, geez, why is this happening? And to attribute it all to bad genes will do nothing but perpetuate the drivers. I'll just come back, John, for this last slide, and I'll let you bring us home with these conclusions, John. And so we've touched on this, but just to conclude, it's sort of actionable tips that people can do, and some of the health benefits that will follow.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good way to bring it home. I just, again, I always say, give it a try. A lot of people say I'm not that hungry in the morning, or I just don't have that much of an appetite. Just work at it, just like you would anything else. I'm not sure if it's going to take, like someone 2 weeks or 2 months, but I know people get there once they start to adopt the type of shift that, that we've discussed. And, I think socially it's challenging to not eat dinner after 7 for a lot of people. That's when they're, more of the get-togethers take place, and whether it's a family meal or it's some type of gathering outside of the home, I fully empathize with that. But do your best to eat less, and one of the ways that people can have, I think, a better control over that situation, Mark, for lack of a better description. I don't know, if control is the right word, but is to eat more protein early in the day. And there have been countless studies, whether it's a human study or an animal study. If you give any population of mammals like free choice to food, right, there's a certain amount of protein that needs to be consumed every day, or every species of mammal will overconsume every other type of food, right? A lot of times people are looking for protein with these meals, and this could really, this would happen if it's outside of your control and you're going outside to some type of social gathering, you're going to some event, you're eating dinner with a large group of people, chances are those environments are not going to serve the food that you and I, generally advocate: high protein, lower carb. It's going to be the antithesis of that. So eat more protein early in the day to both help with, the thermogenesis, the increased metabolic rate, and all the benefits you get from that. But also it's going to really help somebody have, more restraint, I guess, more control, and be comfortable eating less if they do have to eat at a less ideal time, like 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. You do all you can to eat your smallest meal at the end of the day. And I think it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? But this is a big one. This is a cut that tends to bleed. Help people bleed out a lot more with this. You can really help yourself by putting a bandage or maybe a tourniquet on this cut. Some of the others we've talked about, whether it's the exposure to blue and white light, critical as well. But I think eating at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night for many people, it's the linchpin, right? It's the one that the whole house of cards comes down.
Awesome conclusion. And we hope that our Health Edge listeners resonate with what we're sharing. I know it will. And please share this information with friends, family, those you love. John and I have basically zero social media outreach. So much of the Health Edge community is just word of mouth. So please feel free to share this information with those. Some of the studies that we've reviewed, the slide deck will be on our Health Edge podcast website, and we hope that is helpful to people. And more good news to use. And John, great seeing you, and great. I love these topics. They're awesome.
I do as well, Mark. Thanks so much. Yeah, you have a great weekend, buddy.
You as well. Take care, my friend.
You too. Love you. Bye.
Love you too.